They laughed when I scrubbed their floors. They mocked me when I ate their leftovers. And they celebrated when they threw me out into the freezing Chicago streets with nothing but the clothes on my back. But what the Morrison family didn't know was that the orphan boy they tormented for 15 years was actually the sole heir to a $3 billion empire. And today was the day they would all pay. My name is Marcus Reed. And this is the story of how I went from sleeping on cardboard boxes to owning the very mansion where I once scrubbed toilets. I was 7 years old when the social worker dropped me off at the Morrison estate in Lake Forest, Illinois. Mrs. Patricia Morrison stood at the top of the marble staircase, her designer dress probably worth more than most people's cars, looking down at me like I was dirt on her Louboutin heels. "You'll stay in the basement," she said coldly. "And you earn your keep." See, the Morrisons didn't take me in out of kindness. They took me in for the monthly foster care checks. $1,200 that they pocketed while feeding me table scraps and dressing me in clothes from the donation bin. The Morrison family had 3 children. Brandon, the eldest at 19, already working at his father's real estate company. Jessica, 17, who treated me like her personal servant. And Kyle, 15, who seemed to take genuine pleasure in making my life miserable. Every morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. in my basement room, really just a converted storage space with a thin mattress on the floor. I'd prepare breakfast for the family, pack their lunches, and then walk 3 miles to school because they refused to let me ride the bus with their children. At school, things weren't much better. I wore the same 3 outfits on rotation, all sizes too big or too small. The other kids called me Garbage Boy because I always smelled like the cleaning chemicals I used at the Morrison house. But I had a secret. A secret that kept me going through every insult, every beating, every night I went to bed hungry. My mother, my real mother, she'd whispered something to me the night before she died. I was only 3 years old, but I remembered her words like they were tattooed on my soul. "Marcus, baby, you're special. When you turn 18, find Mr. Harrison Chen. He'll tell you everything. Promise me." "Promise, Mommy." I'd promised. And for 15 years, that promise was the only thing that kept me alive. The worst day of my life, or so I thought at the time, came 3 months before my 18th birthday. It was Jessica Morrison's engagement party. Richard Morrison, the patriarch, had invited everyone who was anyone in Chicago's elite society. Mayors, business tycoons, celebrities. The house was filled with people who each wore more money on their wrists than I'd seen in my entire life. My job? Serve drinks, clear plates, and stay invisible. I was in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, when Kyle Morrison stumbled in, drunk on his father's expensive scotch. His eyes landed on me, and that cruel smile I'd come to know so well spread across his face. "Hey, Garbage Boy," he slurred. "I just had the best idea." Before I could react, he grabbed my arm and dragged me into the main hall where hundreds of guests were mingling. The string quartet stopped playing. All eyes turned to us. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kyle announced, his voice echoing through the mansion, "I'd like to introduce you all to Marcus, the Morrison family charity case." Laughter rippled through the crowd. My face burned with shame. "Tell them what you do, Marcus," Kyle continued, shoving me forward. I stumbled, nearly falling. More laughter. "That's right, he's our janitor. Our live-in servant. But here's the thing." Kyle's voice dropped to a mock whisper that everyone could still hear. "He actually thinks he's going to make something of himself. Tell them about your little college applications, Garbage Boy." My jaw clenched. Yes, I'd been applying to colleges. I'd maintained a 4.0 GPA despite everything, studying by flashlight in my basement room after finishing my chores at midnight. I'd scored a 1580 on the SATs. I had a chance. He thinks he's going to be somebody. Kyle laughed, and the crowd joined in. As if any college would want a nobody orphan who smells like bleach. Patricia Morrison watched from across the room, a champagne flute in her hand, not saying a word to stop her son. Then Brandon Morrison, the golden child, stepped forward. At 22, he already had that corporate executive swagger, that unearned confidence that came from never having to work for anything. Kyle, Brandon said, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder. Be nice to Marcus. After all, he turned to face me, his eyes cold. Where else is he going to go? He has nothing. He is nothing. We're all he's got. The words hit harder than any of Kyle's fists ever had. Now get back to the kitchen, Brandon said quietly, before we remind you what happens when you forget your place. I knew what he meant. The discipline sessions in the basement, the withheld meals, the threats to have me sent to a group home, which they convinced me would be even worse. But as I walked back to the kitchen, something inside me changed. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't scared. I was angry. And I was counting down the days. 73 more days until my 18th birthday. 73 more days until I could find Mr. Harrison Chen. 73 more days until the truth. I never made it to 73 days. 2 weeks after the engagement party, Richard Morrison called me into his study. This was unusual. He rarely acknowledged my existence directly. Marcus, sit down, he said, gesturing to a chair. His voice was too calm, too controlled. Warning bells went off in my head. I sat. We've decided that this arrangement isn't working anymore, he began. You're almost 18, nearly an adult. And frankly, we've been more than generous with you for all these years. Generous. The word almost made me laugh. We're going to have to ask you to leave, he continued. Today, actually. We've packed your things. He slid an envelope across his desk. There's $500 in there. Consider it a parting gift. My heart raced. But I'm still 17. You can't just dash. We can, and we are, Patricia Morrison said from the doorway. I hadn't even heard her come in. You should be grateful we're giving you anything at all. Most foster families would have kicked you out with nothing. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Not our problem, Richard said flatly. You have 1 hour to leave the property. I wanted to tell them about Mr. Harrison Chen. I wanted to throw it in their faces that in just a few months, everything would change. But something stopped me. Some instinct that told me to stay silent, to wait. So I took the envelope, went to my basement room, and packed my pathetic collection of belongings into a garbage bag. 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and my mother's photograph, the only thing I had of hers. As I walked out of the Morrison estate for what I thought might be the last time, Kyle was waiting by the door. Hey, garbage boy, he called out. Don't forget you're nothing. You'll always be nothing. I kept walking. It was January in Chicago. 20 degrees below zero with the wind chill. I had $500, a garbage bag of clothes, and nowhere to go. I spent that first night in a 24-hour diner, making a single cup of coffee last 6 hours while I figured out my next move. The waitress, a kind woman in her 50s named Rosa, could tell I was in trouble. Rough night, honey? She asked during the 3 a.m. lull. I told her everything. The Morrisons, being kicked out, all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I have a storage room in the back, she finally said. It's not much, but there's a cot. You can stay there while you figure things out. In exchange, you help me with the morning rush. I almost cried. Why would you help me? Rosa smiled sadly. Because everybody deserves a chance, kid. And something tells me you're going to be somebody someday. If only she knew. I spent the next 2 months living in that storage room, working at the diner, and planning. On my 18th birthday, I was going to find Mr. Harrison. And then everything would change. March 15th, my 18th birthday. I'd located Mr. Harrison through online searches. He was a partner at Chin & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. Getting an appointment wasn't easy, but I'd been persistent, calling every day for a week until his secretary finally put me through. "Mr. Chen, my name is Marcus Reed," I'd said. "My mother was Sarah Reed. She told me to find you when I turned 18. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, "Come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. Come alone." I showed up 15 minutes early, wearing the best clothes I had, which still looked like thrift store rejects. The law firm was on the 73rd floor of the Willis Tower, overlooking all of Chicago. The reception area alone probably cost more than the Morrison estate. I gave my name to the receptionist, and within minutes, a distinguished-looking Asian man in his 60s appeared. His eyes widened when he saw me. "My God," he whispered. "You look just like him." "Like who?" I asked. "Come with me," he said. He led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. Once the door was closed, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Marcus, what I'm about to tell you will change your life forever," Mr. Chen began. "Your mother, Sarah Reed, was the personal assistant and later the secret wife of my best friend, James Thornton." The name meant nothing to me. "James Thornton," Mr. Chen continued, "was the founder and CEO of Thornton Industries, one of the largest pharmaceutical and medical device companies in the world. When he died 15 years ago, he left behind an empire worth over $3 billion. My head was spinning. "I don't understand what this has to do with me." Mr. Chen pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "Marcus, James Thornton was your father, and according to his will, you are his sole heir." The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table. That's impossible," I stammered. "I'm nobody. I'm just an orphan. I've been living in a storage room. You are Marcus James Thornton," Mr. Chen said firmly. "Your mother changed your last name to Reed after your father died, trying to protect you from some complicated family dynamics. She placed you in foster care temporarily while she tried to sort everything out, but then she got sick." He pulled out more documents. Birth certificates, DNA tests, legal papers. "When your mother died, you disappeared into the foster system. I've been searching for you for 15 years, Marcus. The will specified that you couldn't inherit until you turned 18, and that you had to come find me yourself. Your father wanted to make sure that whoever claimed this inheritance truly understood what your mother had told you about him." I stared at the documents. My father's picture stared back at me from a magazine cover. He had my eyes, my nose, my jaw. "The estate has been in a trust, managed by the board of directors," Mr. Chen explained. "But it's always been yours. Every penny. Every property. Every share of stock. Thornton Industries, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, all of it." "How much?" I whispered. "As of this morning? $3.2 billion. The number was so large it didn't feel real. I'd been scrubbing toilets for table scraps while sitting on a fortune that could buy a small country. "What do I have to do?" I asked. Mr. Chen smiled. "First, we need to establish your legal identity. Then, we start the process of transferring everything to you. And Marcus?" He leaned forward. "We're going to need to talk about the Morrison family." My head snapped up. "What about them?" "Your father's estate includes the mortgage company that holds the note on Richard Morrison's business properties," Mr. Chen said, his smile turning cold. As of 6 months ago, they'd been behind on their payments. Way behind. When you take control of the estate, you'll have some decisions to make. For the first time in 15 years, I smiled. Really smiled. Tell me everything. The next 3 months were a blur. I moved into a penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan temporary housing while I decided which of my several properties to actually live in. I had a chef, a personal assistant, a driver, a stylist, and more lawyers than I could count. But I kept it all quiet. No media announcements. No splashy reveals. Mr. Chen and I had a plan, and it required patience. First, I worked on myself. I hired a personal trainer and started working out every day. I got a proper haircut from a stylist who charged more for one session than the Morrisons had spent on me in a year. I bought clothes that actually fit, from designers I'd never heard of. I enrolled in Northwestern University's business program not because I needed the degree, but because I needed to learn how to run the empire I'd inherited. I studied corporate law, finance, real estate development. I absorbed everything like a sponge. But most importantly, I learned about the Morrison family business. Richard Morrison ran Morrison Development Group, a mid-sized real estate company that focused on luxury residential properties. They'd been successful for years, riding the Chicago real estate boom. But recently, they'd overextended themselves, taking on too much debt to finance several high-profile projects. And guess who held most of that debt? Thornton Capital, the investment arm of my father's company. They owed $47 million, with payments they'd been struggling to make. They were currently 3 months behind. I called a board meeting at Thornton Industries. As the new CEO technically, I'd always been the CEO, just absent I had every right. The board members, all older men and women who had known my father, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. I was 18 years old, wearing a Tom Ford suit, sitting at the head of a table where billions of dollars in decisions were made. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steady. I want to talk about Morrison Development Group. The plan was simple, really. Elegant in its cruelty. I spent 6 months studying the Morrison business, learning every weakness, every vulnerability. Then, through a series of shell companies and proxies, I began to squeeze. First, I bought up several properties adjacent to their main development project, a luxury high-rise they were building in downtown Chicago. Then I announced plans to build a competing project, bigger and better, that would completely undercut their market. Their investors got nervous. Some pulled out. Then, I had Thornton Capital call in their debt. All $47 million, due immediately, as per the terms of their loan agreement, which they'd violated by missing payments. Richard Morrison suddenly had 30 days to come up with $47 million or lose everything. I watched from my penthouse as the Morrison empire began to crumble. It was beautiful. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Through my connections at Northwestern, I arranged to give a guest lecture on real estate development. The professor, not knowing anything about my past, thought it was a generous offer from a young entrepreneur. He advertised it widely. Local business leaders were invited, including the Morrison family. The lecture was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the business school's largest auditorium. I arrived early, wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than a semester's tuition, looking nothing like the scared kid who'd scrubbed their floors. The auditorium filled up. I saw them enter: Richard, Patricia, Brandon, Jessica, and Kyle Morrison, all dressed in their finest, all there to network and maintain appearances, while their world fell apart behind closed doors. They didn't recognize me. Why would they? The last time they'd seen me, I was a skinny, scared teenager in clothes that didn't fit. Now I was a man, confident, polished, and worth billions. The professor introduced me. Tonight, we're honored to have Marcus Thornton, CEO of Thornton Industries, one of the youngest billionaires in America, here to speak about real estate development and family legacy. I stepped up to the podium. The lights were bright, but I could see the Morrison family in the third row. They still hadn't recognized me. "Good evening," I began. "Thank you for having me. Tonight, I want to talk about something a bit different. I want to talk about the price of cruelty." That got their attention. "You see, I grew up in Chicago, but I didn't grow up like most of you. I grew up in a basement, sleeping on a thin mattress, eating table scraps, wearing donated clothes that never quite fit." I saw Patricia Morrison shift uncomfortably. Recognition was starting to dawn. "I was taken in by a wealthy family. They collected foster care checks while treating me like a servant. They beat me, starved me, humiliated me. And when I was still a minor, they threw me out onto the streets in the middle of winter with $500 and nowhere to go." Richard Morrison's face had gone pale. Kyle was staring at me with his mouth open. "That family told me I was nothing, that I would always be nothing. And you know what? I believed them. For years, I believed them." I paused, letting the silence build. "But they made one critical mistake. They never asked who I really was. They never questioned why a 3-year-old ended up in foster care. They just assumed I was worthless because I had nothing." I clicked to the next slide. It showed a photo of my father, James Thornton. This was my father, James Thornton. Billionaire, philanthropist, CEO. He died when I was 3 years old. My mother, trying to protect me from certain family members who wanted to contest the will, changed my name and placed me in temporary foster care while she sorted out the legal issues. Another click. A photo of my mother, beautiful and smiling. But then my mother got sick, and I disappeared into the system. And a certain family in Lake Forest, Illinois saw an opportunity to collect checks from the state while getting free labor from a child. I looked directly at the Morrisons now. They were frozen in their seats. That family is here tonight. Richard Morrison, Patricia Morrison, Brandon, Jessica, and Kyle Morrison. Every head in the auditorium turned to look at them. "Stand up," I said quietly. "Please." They didn't move. I said, "Stand up." My voice was steel now. Slowly, shakily, they stood. "Tell everyone what you did," I said. "Tell them how you treated a child in your care." Silence. "No." "Then let me tell them." I clicked through slides showing everything. Photos I'd secretly taken over the years on a cheap phone. The basement room. The bruises. Texts between the Morrison kids mocking me. Financial records showing they'd pocketed the foster care money. The audience gasped. Someone started recording on their phone. "You told me I was nothing," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You laughed when you humiliated me at your daughter's engagement party. You celebrated when you threw me out with nowhere to go." I leaned forward, gripping the podium. "But here's the thing about being underestimated. Here's the thing about being treated like garbage. It teaches you who the real garbage is." Patricia Morrison was crying now. Richard looked like he might have a heart attack. "And now," I continued, "let me tell you what happens next. Morrison Development Group owes my company, Thornton Capital, $47 million. That debt is due in full in 7 days. I know you can't pay it. I know you've been scrambling, begging other lenders for help." I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Here's my offer. You have 2 choices. Choice 1, you declare bankruptcy, lose everything, and spend the rest of your lives knowing that the boy you tortured ended up destroying your entire legacy." I paused. Choice 2, you transfer full ownership of Morrison Development Group to me for $1. You publicly apologize for what you did to me, and you each commit to working at one of my properties as janitors for 1 full year at minimum wage. After that year, I'll give you back your company debt-free." The gasping in the audience was audible now. "What's it going to be?" I asked. "Pride or survival?" The video of that lecture went viral within hours. 20 million views in the first day. The story of the billionaire orphan who'd been abused by his foster family and returned to make them pay captivated the entire country. The media descended on the Morrisons like vultures. Their friends abandoned them. Their business partners cut ties. Even Jessica's fiancé called off the engagement. 3 days after the lecture, Richard Morrison called Mr. Chen and agreed to my terms. The contract signing took place in my office at Thornton Industries headquarters, the same office where my father had once run his empire. The Morrisons arrived looking defeated, broken. "Before you sign," I said, "I want you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. Not really. This is about justice. This is about making sure that no other foster kid ever has to go through what I went through." I slid a document across the table. "I'm establishing the Sarah Reed Foundation for Foster Children, named after my mother. It will be funded with $500 million initially, with the mission of improving foster care systems and protecting children from abuse. And you," I looked at each of them in turn, "are going to be the public face of it. You're going to spend the next year telling your story, warning other families against what you did, and working to make amends." Patricia Morrison actually sobbed. "Good. And one more thing," I added. "That basement room where you kept me, I'm turning it into a museum. Anyone who wants to become a foster parent in Illinois will have to tour it first to see what happens when you treat a child as less than human." They signed the papers with shaking hands. For the next year, I watched as the Morrisons learned what it meant to have nothing. They cleaned toilets at my properties. They scrubbed floors. They took out trash. And every day, they wore uniforms with my company logo on them. Kyle, the one who had called me Garbage Boy, was assigned to the same 24-hour diner where Rosa had given me shelter. Rosa, who I'd made a manager and part owner of the establishment, supervised him personally. The irony was delicious. Brandon, who told me I was nothing, worked at the Morrison estate, which I'd bought at auction for pennies on the dollar. He cleaned the same mansion where he'd once been a prince. Jessica worked at a homeless shelter I'd founded, seeing daily what could have happened to me if I'd been less lucky. Richard and Patricia worked at a youth center in one of Chicago's roughest neighborhoods, mentoring kids who reminded them every day of the child they'd abused. But something unexpected happened during the year. They changed. I don't mean they suddenly became good people. Redemption doesn't work like that. But they began to understand. Really understand. I watched through reports and occasional visits. I saw Kyle break down crying while mopping floors, Rosa comforting him while telling him stories about the scared kid he'd tormented. I saw Brandon sitting with homeless teenagers, listening to their stories, seeing his own cruelty reflected back at him. I saw Richard Morrison, the proud businessman, playing basketball with kids who had nothing, and realizing that wealth meant nothing without humanity. And Patricia. Patricia started volunteering extra hours at the youth center, working with girls who'd been abused in foster care, crying with them, holding them, telling them she was sorry. Not to me. To them. The year ended on March 15th. My 19th birthday. The Morrisons arrived at my office for the final contract signing, the one where I would return their company to them as promised. They looked different. Humbler. Older. Changed. We sat in silence for a moment. "I've been told," I finally said, "that true strength isn't in revenge. It's in mercy." I slid the contract across the table. "Morrison Development Group is yours again, as promised. Debt-free. but with conditions. Richard looked up, wary. Condition 1. 20% of your annual profits go to the Sarah Reed Foundation. Forever. He nodded. Done. Condition 2. You never, ever take another foster child into your home. If you want to help kids, you do it through donations and volunteering. But you don't get to have that kind of power over a child again. Agreed, Patricia whispered. Condition 3. I said, my voice softer now. You keep working. Maybe not as janitors anymore. But you keep volunteering at that youth center. You keep showing up for those kids. You've seen now what it's like to have nothing. Don't ever forget it. We won't, Brandon said. And for the first time, I believed him. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over Chicago. The city where I'd once slept on cardboard. The city I now owned a piece of. You know what the funny thing is? I said without turning around. If you had just been kind to me, if you had just treated me like a human being, I would have shared everything with you when I came into my inheritance. I would have made sure you never had to worry about money again. I turned to face them. But you chose cruelty. And cruelty has a price. Kyle stood up suddenly. Marcus, His voice broke. I'm so sorry. For everything. I was a kid, and that's not an excuse, but I'm so sorry. I looked at him for a long moment. The boy who'd tormented me for years. Who'd humiliated me in front of hundreds of people. Who'd called me garbage boy and made me wish I was dead. I know, I said finally. Rosa told me you've been doing good work at the diner. That you're different now. I am, he said, tears streaming down his face. I swear I am. Good, I said. Because the world has enough cruelty in it. Be better. All of you. Be better. They left my office without another word, carrying the contracts that gave them back their company and their lives. I never spoke to them again. But I kept tabs on them. And you know what? They kept their word. The Morrison family became major donors to foster care charities. They volunteered. They advocated for policy changes. They used their story as a cautionary tale. They didn't become saints. But they became better. And sometimes that's enough. 5 years have passed since that day. I'm 23 years old now. Still running Thornton Industries, but I've made it something different. Something my father would be proud of. We've pivoted into healthcare technology for underserved communities. We're developing affordable medical devices. We're funding research into diseases that pharmaceutical companies ignore because they're not profitable. I've donated over $1 billion to various causes. I still live modestly by billionaire standards, anyway. I don't need 10 cars or 3 yachts. I need purpose. The Sarah Reed Foundation has helped thousands of foster children. We've reformed systems in 12 states. We've funded mental health services, education programs, legal aid for kids aging out of the system. And Rosa? She retired last year with a generous pension and a gift of $5 million. She cried when I gave it to her. She tried to refuse it, but I insisted. Because she saved my life when she didn't have to. That's what I've learned through all of this. Revenge is satisfying in the moment, but it's empty. What fills you up is helping others. Using your pain to prevent someone else's. I still think about those days in the Morrison basement sometimes. The hunger, the fear, the hopelessness. But I don't think about them with bitterness anymore. I think about them as lessons. As fuel. Because the truth is, the Morrisons didn't break me. They forged me.